Really inspirational and spot on. There is so much content that Frank talked about that we want to come alongside and flesh out further. In fact, I'm sure that's a lot of things that are on your mind, particularly as it relates to e-commerce and omni-channel. There's a lot of the content we'll talk about, particularly this afternoon, but even into tomorrow morning when we get into more of the brick and mortar classes of trade, both home improvement as well as traditional retail. And that's just going to be the flow for, as you've seen in your agendas and even on your name tags on the back, that we'll spend kind of high-level thinking today. We're going to really broaden out the lens for the session right now, get real specific with some of the e-commerce implications with Russ Derringer, who's our executive director of our e-commerce council. And Russ has been with us for the last couple years. He actually used to work with us 5 or 6 years ago, and he's come back to lead this effort for us. And we are really starting to do some really fun things with many of you, and certainly a lot of other folks creative and incremental. So we'll come back to that in a moment. But everybody feels this movement. This is a freight train moving forward, where we're now 9% of U.S. retail sales for e-commerce. That's already up almost 2 points in just a year. And this is actually a benchmark that we do. You can see the census data out there that mirrors this, but we are benchmarking all of you. In fact, this is hundreds of companies that feed into this vendor benchmark we do every year. And we also ask then, where do you think it'll be in 3 years? Where do you think it'll be in 5 years? And this is every category, not just those represented in this room. This actually includes food and consumables. This includes office and consumer electronics, some that are further along the curve than others. But the point is, we are quickly on a drumbeat to 20%. So if we're 9% today, it very well may double just in 5 years. Could it double from there? You know, a lot of people think the long-term ceiling is 20%. Why not? Why would it be stopping at 20%? Based on what we see today, the trajectory is tremendously high. And we'll come back to, well, how do you define this? Is this really pure play only? Or is there a blend of omni-channel where indeed there has a store element to it that is infused and driven by digital, which is actually an important consideration, which we'll come back to. But that's a steep slope. In fact, you're seeing 2 points, up 6 points, up another 5 or 6 points in a very short order over the next few years. We do a lot of work on Walmart. We do a lot of work on Amazon in addition to the home improvement class of trade. But I wanted to contextualize this. This is not drawn to scale as a disclaimer. But Walmart, who's had a better performance just over the last 3 to 6 months on .com, is now roughly on pace to do $20 billion this year for Walmart.com and their digital properties. A big chunk of that certainly is U.S., but that's a global lens, and we wanted to compare and contrast that to Amazon's global lens. And not only is the size difference really important for their pure play comparisons, meaning like the 1P, what Amazon actually discloses is $125 billion globally, is actually marked up. It's more like $350 billion if you include their third-party marketplace. Almost half the units now are sold on Amazon, but the revenue they generate from that is only 10-15%. It's really a commission and royalty. So if you mark it up, they're already $350 billion. And in comparison to Walmart, who's only $500 billion above that, only is a big number. The point is the speed of growth. That baseline is huge, and it's growing 25% with $6 billion of capital thrown at it every year. They're spending a ton of money, all sorts of money, particularly around infrastructure and supply chain and technology. Walmart's also spending a lot of money, not only to acquire Jet and some of the new brands, and to really be aggressive in their forward lean, which is much more a successful formula for them of late, but really still it's a sum of only $1 billion for somebody that's actually bigger than Amazon. So wanted to put that in context and why Amazon is so important to get your arms around, both in size, the speed of growth off of a really big denominator in comparison to the next biggest guy with Walmart meaningfully smaller. I don't know if you have all read Jeff Bezos' annual shareholder letter. He writes a fantastic one every year. If you don't read any other shareholder letters by CEOs, you have to read Warren Buffett's and you have to read Jeff Bezos. The one where he really pounds home, and this year's I think was probably the best ones I've read from him, was really around day 2 companies and this customer obsession, but also then not only that long-term thinking, but high-velocity decision-making. We won't get into that a whole lot right here, but they're so willing to go into the deep end of the pool all the time, invent, pioneer, be willing to fail, and do that with excellence that I've never seen any other company. And we've studied hundreds of them over the last 20 years. I've never seen anything like it. I actually thought it was really neat that Warren Buffett called Bezos a different species. He really is. His mindset and the whole organization that is packaged through that is something that is worth studying and understanding as best you can. So that's a short 3-page read that I would encourage you to find. It's pretty easy to find. Or the book that I would recommend that really gets under the hood of Amazon is called The Everything Store. I've recommended that all times, but it's something that would really understand how they think and how they process, even early on as a company, that really gets to these 5 core principles that Jeff is a champion for and certainly obsessed with, that is really ingrained in their culture. All right, let's move a little bit now and kind of think about the next 5 years. And again, this is going to be a blend now as we start to think about our business at brick and mortar and e-commerce. How do we start to do this dance to make it an accretive win? It was interesting to hear Frank talk about this teeter-totter. I actually want to explore that further. Maybe we can even do that in Q&A. I do think this time is ripe for suppliers to really lean in a little bit further at a greater level than retailers, because retailers have a little bit fewer options in front of them with their own physical assets. And so as we look forward, one of the things we talked about with that square footage growth that is really important to keep in mind, as that goes away and as traffic is flat, and we're talking about price and mix as the real driving force behind most of retail, if you're used to 3 to 4% end market growth for brick and mortar retail, we would highly recommend think about cutting that in half, because we just don't think we're going to see more than 1 to 2% on a broad scale. In fact, the biggest winner right now in traditional class of trade is Walmart, and they're growing more in that 1 to 2% range, at least on a same-store sales basis. But again, their square footage growth has gone from 3% to 1%. Their total goal is 3 to 4% in the long run. That is where they want to aim. It is really difficult to get there in this new world. Even in their international, where they've got a lot more white space, they're not hitting that mark. For Sam's Club, they're not hitting that mark. And for Walmart US, it's really difficult. So when the biggest winner, both in size and even in relative growth right now, is doing 1 to 2%, and you're seeing everybody else just struggle to breathe or stay alive or keep their doors open, 1 to 2% may be the new world order. So if you're used to a straight line from the last 10, 15 years, or if you're assuming anything in a compounding growth rate north of 3%, we would suggest shaving that. And again, a lot of that is implied to moving through e-commerce, which certainly with that 8 to 9% moving to 20%, we're going to come back to the scenarios that would play out within your business mix, which will likely need not only a change in resources, but maybe a change in mindset. Certainly the retailers will need to think about these new services or maybe new consumers to reach, because we talked about the only real growth is with what you have, but maybe there are new channels or new consumers to consider. And Mark's going to go real deep into that within the Pro tomorrow, which I think is a great example of where we're seeing some winning opportunities beyond what is just a normal DIY customer. And certainly as we're seeing a big rationalization, the consolidation implications from there, the bigger will get bigger. The haves and the have-not gap will just continue to widen, and therefore the consolidation will just continue to move forward in really all classes of trade. Now, this mix is probably representative of a lot of people in this room, and really a lot of different channels. These are good round numbers to consider as a circle of business. Still 80% in brick and mortar, 15% may overlay and have some relevance in both channels, and still in most cases less than 5% for a lot of the hard lines categories. Soft lines have moved much further and faster with this penetration. Food and consumables is still more in the 5% range, and there's a lot of other categories that certainly are above that. But let's say this is the base case for a lot of people in this room. Now, this is just a sales view, mind you. What we're starting to see much more dramatically is if you remove sales from the mix and say digitally influenced, it's the exact opposite. It's e-commerce, 80% digitally infused, and then a little bit more overlap in the stores, but very little is now driven solely by the stores, and especially inside the stores, that will drive that path to purchase. That's why we're spending a lot of time on a digital path to purchase, because it's 80% or north of where the consumer starts, almost in every category, but certainly a lot of those represented in this room. I say this because most of the growth that we just talked about, 80% of the growth is now being driven by e-commerce, but yet 80% of the business is here. And so with that 80% of brick and mortar in size, 80% digitally infused, and 80% of the growth, the question I'd like to present everybody here is, which 80% are you focused on? This is really important to sink your teeth into. What are you focused on? Are you focused on the bulk of my business because I have to? That's what we've been focused on. We want to win in the 80%. Or are you spending your time on 80% of the growth that is actually influenced by 80% of this digital world? That's, I think, a different mindset, because most companies that we engage with, either at an intimate level or even the companies and the retailers we study consistently, even for their shareholders or prospective shareholders, that's the equity research side of our business that we birthed out of. Most companies are not anywhere close to this yet. So let me walk through a few scenarios as we see this over the next 3 to 5 years that, as it relates to retail, or again, more importantly, your mix at retail, that could be at play. If you're really focused on that big chunk of business and really nothing else, and there are probably very few in this room that are there, this leads to a very underwhelming scenario where, okay, 10% of my business, maybe 5% to 10% goes to e-commerce, and that's growing 20%. That's a natural tailwind of that end market. But right now, brick and mortar, and it kind of depends on who your customers are, certainly. If it's in the home improvement class of trade, it's nowhere close to this right now. But let's say you have a pretty big end market that reaches into other corners of retail. Let's say in a bad scenario, it actually is down a point or two, all in. And that, even with 20% growth on e-commerce, this is not only an underwhelming scenario from a top-line perspective, it is crushing on your earnings. This is a negative mix shift as it relates to lower profitability and in something that is not a winning scenario. A more likely scenario, what we'd say, is a base case for a lot of companies. And this is what we're seeing in a lot of pockets right now. All right, 80% of my business, it's pretty flat. And maybe it's up modestly, and maybe I can do something to goose it and drive it and be a little more proactive there. But boy, I'm now at 5%, quickly on the way to 20%, growing 20%, and effectively almost entirely my top line is driven now by e-commerce. Especially if there's an opportunity to really lean into that through a very specific lens. It doesn't have to be Amazon as a specific opportunity. It could be HomeDepot.com. It could be Walmart.com. But the math of this actually does drive 4% revenue growth. So when we talked about 1% to 2% for retail, this is a scenario that suppliers have more opportunities to lean into than most retailers do. Again, in actually more of a net profitable lean. But the last scenario, what we would suggest, is probably the most upside, as you really start to not only plan from a high level, but start to position your teams across the entire organization. In fact, a lot of what Russ will talk about is really about resourcing your teams and equipping your teams to fit this new paradigm. But let's say that we have now brick and mortar business. If I only isolate half of my business into brick and mortar, let's call it 60% in this scenario. And again, I'm doing everything I can to make it 1%, but maybe it's a little more of I'm going to manage that for cash 1%. And we're going to really talk around those scenarios tomorrow much further. But now I've got a middle 20% of my business that is much more omni-channel driven. And again, a lot of people are already here. There may be some upside to it, but almost a third of my growth can come through omni-channel. That's going to be up double digits consistently. And there are very few omni-channel opportunities that are not hitting that mark right now. And then e-commerce could be really the icing on the cake, where again, that's still driving 60% of my growth, not all of my growth, but 60% of my growth. And you really start to find ways to make this blend and this mix. But I see very few organizations that are segmented like this yet. So the action item would be, how do I start to segment my business and study it in ways that would fit? And there probably are more segments and layers underneath this. But thinking about both pure play and that omni-channel being an increasingly important part, not only of the top line, but the flow through to the bottom line, especially as that influences then the brick and mortar, which ideally we can make it accretive even for what we can do, not just to the stores, but for the stores. So those are all the confluences at hand. What I'd like to do is spend a few minutes in closing really going through some action items that not only relate to all of this that we're going to talk about today and tomorrow, where we would make the case that e-commerce is absolutely incremental and something that not only is worth your time, but it is the best use of your time to really not just study but deploy. This is not just discovery, but a movement into further investments, especially because we have a whole new consumer and therefore a whole new playbook. All the old rules of retail we think are being rewritten, not only for the retailers themselves, but for suppliers that are engaging with that, and certainly for those retailers that are trying to take a step back and take another step back through their cost cutting or door closures to try to focus more on productivity, which is needed and necessary, but there's certainly no path to shrinking to greatness that we can see. The winning ingredients as we see it at retail are really sevenfold. We'll go into more of these again tomorrow, inclusive of a supply chain perspective that Chris Johnson will lead us. Again, this is the theme of FAST. We're going to talk about fast supply chain. But Frank talked about that experiential at the store. It really just has to be different. What is the differentiated value proposition that actually I will remember? I look at the restaurant business, particularly bar and grill, And I'm sure many of you might go into an Applebee's and then a Chili's. Actually, maybe none of us go to those anymore. But you come out of Fridays, you're like, well, I don't know which one it was. They're all the same. It's no big different. And that's not a winning formula. There has to be a clear point of difference, reason to go, and a reason why I come back because it was memorable. But one of the things that we think Home Depot is excellent at, and why we admire them so much, because their store-level execution is by far best in class. There are not many people these days that have that kind of store-level execution and commitment to their associates, who are incredibly important to getting the job done and engaging with their customers. Most retailers continue to struggle with out-of-stocks, and therefore they cut the inventory, and then they have out-of-stocks, and it's just a slippery slope. But store-level execution is critically important, while obviously doing some work on the digital side, which we'll unpack. And then Frank talked about this loyalty factor. I absolutely think personalization and loyalty, and we see a few retailers that do it okay. Kroger does it okay. Starbucks does it pretty well in the restaurant business or in their beverage business. But again, there are not many retailers or even suppliers that work with the retailers who really crack that nut, especially for a younger consumer who is craving personalization, that is craving for you to reach out to them very uniquely and in a customized way. I wanted just to share the shift just in 5 short years. Again, this is just the mindset of how quickly things are changing. When you think about 5 years ago, Walmart being the 4th largest, and this is just valuation, this is not in revenues, this is just in market capitalization. Walmart was 4th on the list and humming away almost consistently every year at the top of this list. Walmart's now number 17 on the highest U.S. company valuations. Google was number 4, actually I think number 14 before. Now they're number 2. Amazon and Facebook weren't even on this list. And you can see just with Google and Amazon and Facebook, and certainly Apple, and these are all tech companies, but the consumer-facing tech companies is what I'm most fascinated with, that again I think are completely encroaching retail and the new world of retail. So here's the question at hand. With all of that being said, and this is really important to come back to your teams and ask this question, what do we need to do differently within our skills and capabilities to make this pivot? How do we drive this accelerated growth when it's moving so fast? Sometimes it's hard to catch a breath, let alone catch up. This is the real challenge we're seeing for most retailers. They're trying to play this catch-up game to Amazon. Good luck. I showed you that freight train in size and in growth. They're not going to catch up. So what can they do differently to be a winner in the space, and at least maybe to outrun the next guy? They don't have to outrun the bear, but outrun the next guy who may not keep up with the others. And so when we look at suppliers and big brands, here's 5 things that we think, and I'll give you the images here and what these actually mean. These are all digital infusions of how to start to think as a brand in winning big. The first one on the upper left there, really just images. The value of images digitally around your content pages. The impact of this is really starting to go to a whole nother level, certainly with Amazon, but really across all channels. There are a lot of third-party providers now that help streamline that and consolidate that in ways that are really working, and the ways the consumer engage visually that go well beyond the shelf, that actually gets them into the store and to the shelf. Equally important, if not increasingly important, is now video in the middle of the top there. So video is really the next big wave, and we actually do quite a bit of work on the digital advertising component within our company. In fact, now Russ is starting to do more digital advertising as it relates to what it means with Facebook and Twitter and all these platforms that are really starting to influence greater through video and a ton of content. But you combine images with video, now with voice is the upper right. And that is the next big thing that, as we went to Shop Talk, and I don't know if many of you went to Shop Talk a few months ago in Vegas, voice is where a lot of the big companies that we just named are spending the bulk of their time. Even eBay, with the CEO of eBay got up and said, I need to spend all my time on AI because that's where the world is going. And very few of us even consider, I don't even know how my brand fits into artificial intelligence. But those that can play with it early and often, and then really the bottom 2 is a great support structure underneath this. I think many brands are already starting to lean in heavily into both data and algorithms. Data for sure. If we're not heavily involved with data and the analytics around that data to really support some real fact-based decisions, we're behind. And even more specifically, how do we pull in some data scientists? How do we pull in some algorithms to do what Bezos was talking about in his letter as machine learning? That kind of goes over my head. And again, studying retail, I don't know what machine learning means at retail, but those who are nimble and fast do. And they're hiring all sorts of coders to really find creative ways to do retail or even do big brands to get into retail or your digital properties or in a direct-to-consumer mindset, which is an opportunity we've never really considered at a level like we can today. So those are just some winning ingredients as we see it. And again, maybe some best practices as we see suppliers having a different skill set, much more as general managers probably than just a traditional sales and marketing mindset. How do I know the entire business? And now how do I think about it holistically? Seeing the entire end market as the channels are starting to blur together. And that is really important. We're seeing that in all different forms and functions, particularly in the food industry. It's all blurring together between C-stores and grocery stores and restaurants or meal kits. That is fairly uniform across a lot of different industries. So how do you think holistically versus my product, my category, and even my customer? But being customer-centric and customer-obsessed is certainly the mindset that is most significant at the end. But as you're trying to be visible with your customers, flexible with your customers, nimble with your customers, or even transparent, that's the one to me, the transparency, I think, is when Frank talked about the teeter-totter, I think is going to be really important to really think through how do we make this a win-win conversation? And maybe with the consumer thrown in there as a third win, a win-win-win. That is one of the things that for a number of years now, and increasingly in the last couple of years, with less square footage growth, less traffic growth, you're now starting to see a lot of retailers say, gimme, gimme, gimme. I'd like a little bit more, please. Or, I'm going to threaten this private label and kick you off the shelf. That's a very difficult business environment to win in. And that transparency and actually not only calling it out for what it is, but saying, hey, there's different options on the table now. And there is a fuller, holistic viewpoint, not only for other components and other channels, but taking intelligence from those other channels and in a digital world and infusing that back into your customers. This is one of the things that I'm finding very fascinating, particularly with now Mark Laurie with Walmart and the rapid mindset shift within Walmart, and even people saying, well, should we be in Hoboken or should we be in San Bruno? Should we be in Bentonville? Walmart's saying, be at your own headquarters with your own center of excellence because we want you to be excellent at digital and bring that knowledge back to us. That's different. That's a different mindset. How do we make that a win-win? And doing that together and really building those centers of excellence that can be fast and removing those layers of red tape so our people and truly can be empowered to move a little bit faster. Lastly, as we look at action items to consider from here, and again, each of our presenters today and into tomorrow, this is the whole point of why we gather. It's great to hear this from a high level. What can I do differently as a result? What can I do on Monday? What can we start doing at our next board meeting and our executive meetings? But certainly, digital is an opportunity not only to drive sales, but we think to drive discovery. Discovery is actually probably a really important word to circle. And if you start to think about what can we do for our brand to be more discovered through these digital platforms, really is a secret sauce that Amazon has opened those doors, or even Google has opened doors to discovery so you can learn more and find that digital path to purchase. We're going to be beating this horse to death on fast, but it has to, what are the fastest and the least path of resistance to get where we want to get to with using that data that is that foundational element, but not only data that looks in arrears. That's nice. I may give you a red flag, but what is the data you need that could be your lead measures on your business, that can be predictive on where you want to get to, that you can reverse engineer back into your product, that you can reverse engineer back into R&D, shorten those lead times, get in front of the competition, and again, know your customer or your channels or the total end market better than your customers, certainly better than your competitors. But this is why having great information and intelligence can let you make better decisions faster and big bets, big, bold bets, through that lens of studying and learning and understanding this is what it takes to win, not only for the sake of then putting business in action, but ultimately then having this business proposition that is compelling to your consumers and actually compelling to your employees. That's something I think Frank accomplished in spades with Home Depot. He was inspirational to not only to their customers and changing an in-store experience, but he was inspirational and he reached his employees. I think we've seen too many retailers and really a lot of businesses, a lot of day two businesses that have old school thinking that are not inspiring to their employees or starting to mature so much either in business or in age of their employees that they're like, man, when all of our boomers retire, what do we do to backfill and get some millennials into our company? They don't want to work in our company, in our industry. It's important to have that inspirational element, to have your why really red inked and understood clearly and simply to embed that into your product, but more importantly into your people. So those are the action items. We have a few minutes for Q&A before we take another quick break and then get into our e-commerce discussion, which I think will be one of the more fascinating ones that you'll hear from Russ. But what connected with you? What would you say you disagree with? Or what are some things you might like some clarity just in our opening session here this afternoon? Chuck again has the mic. Feel free just to raise your hand. The fewer the questions, the longer your break, or maybe we'll just tighten that down. But I'm happy to answer any questions you might have, and we'll try to do that each time through our presentations. Yep, we got one right over here. Chuck's coming over.
Hi. This question comes from a very biased perspective because for the last 10 years we've built tons and tons of content for Amazon, written content, visual content, and we see from day one the conversion rates, the discoverability rates, all that stuff. But trying to crack the nut of another retailer like Walmart or Home Depot or Target or Babies R Us, and we've done content for all those, retailers have never, outside of Amazon, committed to content from what we see. I don't understand it. I mean, it's so clear that one of Amazon's greatest advantages is its researchability and its discoverability, and that's directly related to content. What is driving that reluctance?
No, it's a great question. It's more of a comment and certainly a question toward that end, and I'm curious if anybody has a broader viewpoint even than we would have as it relates to your own brand across these other channels, saying, I don't understand why they or maybe we found some winning formulas toward that end as a best practice. But as we see it, almost all these retailers are still thinking about e-commerce in most cases in a silo. I don't know, those guys over there, content, it's just got to be for the specific SKUs over there. And yeah, if you can get them the right information at the right time, but it doesn't marry up and it's not cohesive with the strategy. And it's also incredibly important, not truly mobilely accessible. And that's I think one of the biggest missing ingredients for most retailers. They know mobile's important, but as we've talked at previous conferences, maybe for a few years ago now, for a few years running, the most important, if you're to write out your top 5 important elements for an e-commerce strategy, it's mobile, and then it's mobile, and it's mobile. And most retailers are just trying to figure out how to do search right on their own website. Content is and Mark, by the way, is with a content company. So if you have some questions, go to Mark. He has a lot more experience with Content 26 on this than we would. But I think there is still a resistance around commitment toward that end, thinking it's not top of the list. Most people, even with Walmart, I still hear Project Pangea thrown around, and that's something Mike Duke initiated 10 years ago, maybe longer. And they're just trying to get the basics right. Now, Mark coming in will accelerate those basics, and they've got their customer value proposition, which I'm sure content is a big part of it. But they're still just playing catch up to get to first base. Most retailers are still in the batter's box. I don't know if that really answers the question. I don't know if anybody else has experience with content, broadly speaking, beyond Amazon, or leveraging Amazon content into all those other channels that captures the attention of those retailers.